I flew over 9,000 miles to Brisbane for a bucket list trip to Australia and landed just before the city shut completely down. The streets were empty. Businesses were shuttered. It almost had a post-apocalyptic feeling. The skies were ominous and the wind came in violent gusts, the kind that makes you feel like it might pick you up and carry you away at any moment. This wasn't how my trip was supposed to start. For my first trip to the Australian continent, I had booked 3 back-to-back cruises on Royal Caribbean's Quantum of the Seas. The first leg would take me to Whitehaven Beach. The second, a full 2 weeks, would be a sweeping tour around beautiful New Zealand. And the third would venture out into the South Pacific to places I'd only ever seen on maps. But none of it could happen unless I could make it to the ship. And Mother Nature seemed to have other plans. Mine was one of the last flights to arrive in Brisbane before the airport shut down. Tropical Cyclone Alfred, a monstrous Category 4 storm, was headed directly towards the city. Brisbane hadn't faced something like that in generations. And there I was, checking into my hotel, wondering if I'd be able to board in a few days. Wondering if I'd be able to get food and water, wondering if this trip was about to end before it even began. It was a strange few days in Brisbane. The cyclone would venture towards the city, only to change course and drift back to sea like it was taunting us. Every so often the sky would briefly clear, and I'd step outside and explore Brisbane in its eerie solitude. Despite the threatening storm, Brisbane's beauty was unmistakable. An active, youthful city unfolding along the winding Brisbane River, where glass towers, green hills, and friendly faces meet. I had time to do laundry in my hotel room bathtub, and the water did indeed swirl counterclockwise as it drained. But the tension never really left. My hotel room was near the top of a skyscraper, a building that didn't even exist the last time a cyclone hit the city. When the wind picked up, the building swayed. For a second, it felt like I was already at sea. But the cruise was still in limbo. The Port of Brisbane was closed, the prior sailing extended, the one just before mine canceled. Then, on the morning of departure, the update finally came. The port was reopening and Quantum was on her way back to Brisbane. But getting to the port meant detours and flooded roads. Thankfully, my Uber driver enjoyed a challenge. In the terminal? Total chaos. Disembarkation was hours late while thousands of incoming passengers were already waiting outside. So you can imagine how that went. But after hours of waiting, I finally stepped on board and breathed a huge sigh of relief. Because now it was real. This would be my home for the next 26 days. For the first night in a long time, I slept well. The next morning, the ocean was calm. Almost impossibly calm considering what had just passed through. It was a lazy sea day kicking off a short 3-day cruise from Brisbane towards the Great Barrier Reef. And then, the day after that, the pace changed when we reached the port at Taieri Beach. I stepped off a very large cruise ship and climbed into something much smaller.
by the crew.
Within minutes, we were racing through open water, headed for Whitsunday Island and one of the most famous beaches on Earth. We glided into Whitsunday Island, the largest in a chain of 74 islands off the coast of Queensland, most of them protected and largely uninhabited. After exiting the boat, our guide led us up a trail to a lookout, and that's where we saw it for the first time. Whitehaven Beach, a 7-kilometer ribbon of white along the eastern shore. Whitehaven is famous for its sand. Unlike most beaches, it isn't made from crushed coral. It's almost pure silica, about 98% quartz. Over millions of years, ocean currents delivered it grain by grain until it gathered along this shore. We hiked down from the lookout directly to Whitehaven. After stepping onto that sand, you notice something strange. Even after baking in the sun, it was cool under our feet, and it even squeaked when we walked on it. As a photographer, I was in heaven. But then it was time to head back to the big ship. This first sailing only had one port of call, but man, what a port of call it was. And so Quantum turned around and headed back to Brisbane. In Brisbane, I stepped off the ship, made a 180-degree turn, and walked right back on for my second cruise. And this wasn't going to be a quick 4-night cruise. It would be a 2-week adventure in New Zealand. But first, we had to get there, which meant 3 relaxing sea days. Which raises the obvious question: what do you do on sea days? Well, you walk a little, maybe dance a little, maybe sing a little. Ain't no mountain high enough. And mostly you eat. After 3 days at sea, we reached the Bay of Islands, more than 140 small islands scattered across sheltered blue water off the northern coast of New Zealand. And once our ship set anchor, I chose an excursion to one of those small islands, cruising past dramatic scenery and even a few dolphins leaping from the water along the way.
tend to leave the bay sometimes, but they spend most of their time in the bay. Bottlenose dolphins.
After a day of exploring the Bay of Islands, it was time to move on. The ship lifted anchor and set a course for our next stop, Tauranga. The next morning, I woke up to a new harbor and decided to explore on my own. Rising above the town was Mount Maunganui, a name that I may or may not have just pronounced correctly. I looked up at it and thought, I'm gonna climb that mountain. And so I did. It's true, there are more sheep than people in New Zealand. The ratio today is about 5 to 1, and on this hike, I came across a few of them myself. After climbing the mountain, I made my way back to town and explored a bit. By the way, if I'm in a town with a gelato shop, it is my personal mission to find that gelato shop, and I did. And then it was time to head back to the ship. As we glided out to sea, a group of Taurangans waved goodbye. That night, as the ship carried us south, I began to understand the quiet magic of traveling this way. Your room stays the same, but the world outside it constantly changes. You fall asleep in one place and wake up somewhere entirely new. Napier was next. a coastal city in Hawke's Bay facing the Pacific. In 1931, a massive earthquake leveled much of the town, and it was rebuilt almost entirely in the Art Deco style. I explored it by bike, riding along the shoreline beneath heavy, unsettled skies. Photographing while pedaling, as it turns out, is not a skill I possess, so you'll have to imagine some of it. The ride eventually ended at a vineyard for a quiet break. Glasses of local wine poured for those who wanted it, while the storm clouds hovered but never quite committed. Another day ended, and I realized something. I no longer felt like I was on vacation. I felt like I was living inside an unfolding story, something that doesn't always happen on shorter trips. On a journey like this, a rhythm begins to take hold. A steady beat. Sleep, sail, wake, explore. Like a metronome ticking in the background, marking time not in minutes, but in places. And the next day, the beat carried us to Wellington, New Zealand's capital, perched at the southern tip of the North Island along the windswept Cook Strait. I planned to explore the city, but first I headed into a native forest for a nature walk.
A very good evolutionary trait that makes them very survivable, and that's that they taste good.
New Zealand evolved in isolation. There are no native land snakes, few terrestrial predators, and birds once dominated the ecosystem before mammals ever arrived. After hours under a green canopy, I stepped back into the city and began to explore. Wellington is compact, coastal, and unexpectedly vibrant. As the capital of New Zealand, it's a city of colorful facades, steep streets climbing into the hills, and cafes tucked along the waterfront. It's also home to the Beehive, Parliament's executive building, a structure so distinctive that people tend to either admire it or very much not. New Zealand is split in two, the North Island and the South Island. After leaving Wellington, we crossed that divide and arrived in Christchurch. From there, I headed inland on an excursion to Hanmer Springs, a small mountain resort town in the foothills of the Southern Alps. Hanmer is known for its thermal pools, heated by the same tectonic forces that shape this restless landscape. But it carries history too. During World War I, it served as a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers. The old nurses' home still stands, a quiet reminder that recovery here once meant more than soaking in hot springs. Above town, the trails climb into rugged hills that felt, at times, like the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Later that afternoon, we returned to Christchurch. As the ship sailed away, we passed towering stacks of timber bound for export. When we arrived before dawn in Dunedin, the scene felt familiar, more timber rising along the waterfront. Forestry is one of New Zealand's largest industries, much of it plantation-grown pine stacked high before crossing the Pacific. And much of it arrives the old-fashioned way, by train, which felt fitting, because in Dunedin, I had a train to catch. train carried us through narrow gorges and up into misty mountains, which was amazing as the train engineer was a dog. At least I'd like to think so. But the ocean was waiting, and the next day the scale shifted entirely. It was the grand finale of the New Zealand cruise, a passage through Dusky, Doubtful, and Milford Sounds, where mountains rise straight from the sea and waterfalls spill from clouds that never quite lift. The ship turned north to head back to Brisbane. Several quiet sea days followed, long stretches of open water giving the fjords time to settle into memory. Then came the third and final sailing, a week-long voyage into the South Pacific. Its highlight was Mystery Island, a tiny coral islet surrounded by bright reefs and impossibly clear water. It was small enough to walk its entire perimeter, which I did. There are no permanent residents, but when ships arrive, locals come across to set up small market stalls beneath the palms. After glacial valleys and mist-covered peaks, it was a relaxing final stop on my adventure. And then the ship turned back toward Brisbane one last time. When I had first arrived in Brisbane, the city felt abandoned, streets empty, storefronts shuttered, everyone sheltering from the storm. On my final night, it felt completely different. Restaurants full, music drifting through the air, the river glowing under city lights. The same city, but a different moment. A month earlier, I wasn't even sure this journey would begin. A cyclone had nearly canceled it before it started. Instead, the journey took me across 2 countries, through misty fjords and mountain forests, along wild coastlines and into places I had only ever seen in photographs. And yet, it felt like I had only scratched the surface. Australia and New Zealand aren't just destinations, they're entire worlds. Worlds I barely began to explore. The next morning, I boarded a very long flight home, with a camera full of images, a mind full of memories, and a growing realization that the more you see, the more you want to see. More landscapes, more stories, more adventure. Thank you for coming along on this journey with me. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to my channel.